You're listening to the Omni Athlete podcast, your source of peak performance techniques and actionable practices from the world's highest achieving mind, body, and spirit competitors. Join host Rich Walkoff, longtime NFL sportscaster for the San Francisco 49ers, on a journey to access your peak performance state and unlock sport as a transformational human experience. Welcome to Omni Athlete.
Well, Dave Meggyesy, you have been around the game of football probably since you're a little tyke, and from your high school to your college to your pro to your union days, your author, writing a book about the NFL. I find it fascinating that we are at a point where the NFL is in such a in the crosshairs in so many issues.
Yes.
When you step back from it all, what's your basic overview of where the NFL is today versus where it was in your day? I hate to say it, but half a century ago.
Well, I think we can look at it in a number of ways, and maybe one of them is to say certainly the game and the league has, quote, matured. It's become a huge business now. I don't think there's a franchise in the league that is worth less than $1 billion. And as you know, Rich, 10 years ago, or even 20 years ago, this was a preposterous supposition. And I think what happened with it is that and as you know, I worked for the NFL Players Association for 25 years. And as I like to say, is we fought an 11-year war with the owners and we won. And what that means is we won free agency, or gave players the right after 4 years in the league to choose the team that they want to play for. And what that has done is it's more distributed talent throughout the league than ever before. And it's made all teams competitive. And it's added a whole agreement like Major League Baseball, which won free agency in the mid-'70s, to be a much more interesting game for a lot more people. And with that growth, with that interest, of course, has grown, the number of people that are watching games. And we all know about the Super Bowl being the most watched television program in the country during any year. And so that has driven the league to become a mature, if you will, major business. Sure. However, there is the lurking shadow part of the league. And one of them was given the nature of the beast, if you will, the injury rates that happen, and certainly emerging with the effect of brain damage and brain injury that is happening, and the discovery by Dr. Amalu of CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is by saying, look, this game produces a very specific brain disease called CTE, and what we're finding out is a significant number of players, former players, have this disease. And of course, that reflects down into football throughout the culture, college, high school, Pop Warner, and reasonable people are saying, look, kids should not be playing tackle football and having their brains banged around, because they could certainly suffer the consequences later in life. So that's probably the big one that is really looming in front of the ownership and the union, frankly, as well. Given free agency, as you know, players are now making much more money than they ever have. It all came down to how you split the revenues, and players are getting about half the league revenues, and the owners are getting about half the league revenues now, and it's now a $12 billion business. So $6 billion goes to the players, basically about the same number of players that were there 20 years ago, plus funding all the benefits and the rest of it. So it's been a tremendous boom to players if you can play the game, but we're now seeing there is a cost for all this.
Sure. Now, as we both note, you played in a very autocratic, authoritarian-oriented NFL. You're now
That's right. Vince Lombardi was the was the bell cow for that that orientation. You know.
Sure. And it's a militarist. You either listened or you got your butt.
My way or the highway, right?
yeah, my way or the highway. Winning isn't everything; it's the only thing.
Exactly.
Well, now you're describing an NFL that is borderline democratic socialist, when revenues are split and the union has an influence.
Not quite that far yet.
no, but compared to where you were as a player in the 60s,
right,
it's darn close, right?
Well, I think but the biggest thing is I think you could look at it, a different way and say that it has become kind of a model of the capitalist system, in a sense of that employees have the freedom to work where they want to work and to ply their trade based on who wants to hire them and for how much money. That's what free agency means. And all up into 1993, players never had that right. You were assigned a team out of college. They called it the college draft. The management or the owner had total rights to your playing services for as long as you wanted to stay in the league. They could trade you or release you, but you had no choice in where you would play. So you only could negotiate with one employer, as opposed to, in now our case, 32 employers. What that meant was they basically paid you what they wanted to pay you. And you had no, quote, negotiating or bargaining leverage in that system. And by changing that system, I call winning the war, in 1993, we opened the door for players to have that choice, and it's made the league a lot more equitable in terms of talent distribution, and a more interesting league. And that's what's really triggered the growth of the league over the past the past 20 years. It's been phenomenal.
I want to get into the psyche of you as the athlete, and one of the founding members of the Sports Energy Consciousness Group. You seem to have a vision of where you wanted to be as an athlete that transcended the conventional mindset of the time.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting way of asking the question. I think that when I was a player, I wondered why we were related to in the way that we were related to. As you said, pretty much of a militarist kind of top down. We don't have any say-so about anything, not only where we work, but how we play or what we do and that sort of thing. And I think I always questioned that as a player. And then when I was released because of my, political activities, my antiwar activities and the rest of it, and began really thinking about it and writing out of their league, which I did in the early 70s, it occurred to me that the system needed to be changed, and that the players needed a lot more input into the system, not only in terms of where they worked, which is what the story I just said, the war that we won, but also in terms of, in that system, when you have a choice, say you're in, and I've known tons of players who've been in coaching situations that haven't worked for them. And if they research it, or their agents, and they say, well, if I go here, I'm going to be in a much better system for my talents, if they can make that choice to leave. And that's what's made the game more interesting, because you have players going to teams where they can thrive. That's a first level of choice that is primary in our economic system. As an employee, you have a choice of where you want to work. And we gave that right to the player. So it was more than money. It was, how do I extend my career? How do I thrive? How do I excel? And in what kind of system would be best for me? And so you see players moving around because they're going with coaches that they know. They're going into systems that they know that basically allow them to excel as elite athletes. And that's really significant.
Sure. And the old paradigm is you fit into the system.
Exactly.
Not the system is viable, is pliable, flexible.
Exactly.
Embracing
the flexibility is key, Rich, because what coaches know is that that's what goes on, and that's what players are looking for. And so there is this kind of mutual coming together to say, okay, this guy's going to work in my defensive scheme a lot better than this guy. I'm going to go after that guy, and I'm going to pay him money because I know him and I know how he can thrive in this system. And the athlete's thinking, man, I'd love to play for that coach because that system works for me, as an example.
So there you were, tackling Jim Brown in the tail end of his career, the greatest running back of all time.
No, he was in the fat of his career now.
yeah. Well, he's right. He retired.
Well, not quite the tail end, yeah. And go ahead.
What I'm getting at is that you were up against the best in your time, of the greatest of all time, yet you were a revolutionary in a way because you were challenging the existing order as the mid to late 60s blossomed in the anti-war movement and people taken to the streets. But football was kind of separate from that in most respects until a guy like Dave Meggyesy came along and others. So why don't you take us back to that time, because you really were challenging an order that was inviolate, and nobody was doing that at the time, virtually.
Well, it wasn't, and I think you, as your career as a sports journalist, pretty much, you guys didn't cover any kind of issues that were social issues related to your sport. And when I mean, where do we start with all this? But yes, I was involved in the anti-war activity. I was involved in civil rights. But I was a young man, like a young person, like a lot of young people were in the culture at that time, and who were in what we called the movement. And the whole idea to change society that would be work for more people than not. And of course, Tommy Smith and John Carlos in the protest at the '68 Mexico City Olympics, people forget that the protest was about poverty in the African American community in this country. That was the big issue. And the Olympic Project for Human Rights that Harry Edwards had put together was about changing that aspect of society and really looking at that. And so I was tuned into that in my own thinking, in my own life. And I did organize my teammates to sign an anti-war petition, which they did. I had 34 guys sign it. I was involved with the anti-war, St. Louis Anti-War Committee office was in my house in St. Louis. And so I was involved with that, but I didn't think that much of it because half the country was involved in it, and there were many, many, many young people involved with it. But as you said and pointed out, the NFL was kind of the bastion of what we would call the Nixon mentality, the Nixon-Agnew mentality. And when I became a little more public with just doing what I was doing as a citizen, the league responded, and eventually it cost me my job. And that really triggered the writing about their league, because when you're a professional athlete, the competition is so close. It's so close that you have to believe that merit, your ability to play better than your competition, is what allows you to play. Because if that person's better than you, they play. And so when the coaches basically benched me and said, no, your backup, Rocky Roseman, is going to play, and he was inferior to my play, or he played, he just didn't have the skills that I had, really hurt our defense. And that was a major betrayal for me, because it betrayed everything that an athlete needs to believe in if you're at that elite level. In fact, any athlete, well, that's what sport is all about, right? Who runs the fastest, who does the fastest, who can play. And so that really was a major blow to my psyche, if you will, and really was how, looking at it, how the league wanted to defend that position of supporting the, quote, establishment, as we called it at that time, supporting the war, being very militarist and all the rest of it. And so so that really triggered, as I said, the writing about of their league and my really beginning looking at critically what was this game in our culture. What was the NFL?
So you were blackballed because of your political stance, much the way half a century later, Colin Kaepernick is being deprived of an opportunity to play in the league despite horrific quarterbacks.
No, it's really true. It's
the guys in the game, right?
Exactly.
And you too engineered a national anthem protest in a time when that was even more outrageous and challenging of the prevailing.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny story because we got orders from Pete Rozelle to say, because prior to that, guys would be milling around, they'd play the national anthem, and some guys would stand, and so you kind of be quiet. And then the order came down as, no, we want everybody to stand along the sideline, hold your helmet under your left arm, put your right hand over your heart, and turn and look at the flag. And I thought, this is outrageous. Nobody's going to tell me that I have to salute the flag. And so I protested, held my helmet between my knees, bowed my head, and there was this whole line of guys standing on the sideline. So I was clearly obvious what I was doing. And in fact, Bob Bragg, bless his soul, he's probably dead now, but he wrote a column criticizing, he said, the thing that's wrong with the Cardinals is they have these dissidents. And I was a dissident. And then the next home game, some fans on a bed sheet wrote in big letters, the Big Red, which was our moniker, thinks pink, meaning we're a bunch of commies. And they hung it over the top rail of the Busch Stadium so everybody could see it. The Big Red thinks pink.
Right, right.
So it stimulated a little activity, I think. That's what happened.
Well, where did your courageous independent thinking come from, and what guided you intrinsically within yourself through those troubled waters, because you were really taking on the world, if you will?
It's a question that can maybe be asked in retrospect, but I just thought it was outrageous that somebody would tell me you have to salute the flag and here's how you have to do it. Mm-hmm. I'm an adult. It was almost like how you could think about bed checks. Back then we had bed checks. I remember my last year, I had a family and a couple of kids. And so at Lake Forest, Illinois, I rented a house. And during training camp, moved my family up into this rental house. And I said, why should I leave my family for 6 weeks to go to training camp? And that was some concern for the coaches. But of course, I had to sleep in the dorm. I'm an adult human now. Sleep in the dorm and get bed checked. So after our meetings, I could race to the house, spend a half hour or so with my kids, and I'd have to go back for bed check and be in my room. Now I'm an adult. I'm in a very competitive situation. If I don't do my job, I'm going to be replaced. But the mentality was, no, you have to be in your room and get the flashlight shown in your face to make sure that you're there. Now, I don't know if bed checks are still going on, but I hope not.
Well, there's curfew.
There's curfew. Yeah, I call it curfew. Yeah. Well, that was curfew. Yeah, we had 11 o'clock curfew, and that was the whole thing. So, but the whole relationship to the structure as we started talking about this was really quite a bit different. Now, I don't know where I got anything. It just seemed to be a perfectly natural thing. Why 6 weeks with my small kids and my wife? Why not arrange so they could live there and we could be in relationship, be together during training camp? It seemed like a pretty natural thing. And now all teams do it. There's very few teams that actually go away for training camp. I think Pittsburgh still does it, and there's a couple of other teams. But most teams now, they have their training camp, and it's at their club facility, and, people have their houses, and they go to their home to their families and all that. So
yeah. So you're a pioneer, you're a rabble rouser, you're an independent maverick guy, and teams want subsequence. They want everybody on the same page, lockstep. Like you're the buck private, and here comes the sergeant and the captains and the generals, and very many parallels to the military in the NFL. Were they concerned that you would undermine their authority, that you would splinter the team?
Yes, I think it comes down to, and you've probably heard it as a journalist, the operative word is distraction. Meggyesy, you're a distraction. Okay, and what I'm a distraction to is what you just said. Our way and our view of the world and our way of doing things, you doing something different, although it has nothing to do with your job, it has nothing to do with your performance. In fact, it may enhance your performance, but we're not even going to think about that. You're a distraction to our system, to the way that we're viewing the world. And so, yeah, I was called a distraction by a lot of times. Dave, you're being a distraction. What am I doing? I'm just being a person.
Well, how did your teammates respond? Was it a divided locker room? Were you a rallying figure?
I think because of, I was a bit involved in the civil rights movement then, of course, which was percolating pretty heavy when I played in the league. And African American players, I think were understood what I was doing and were very much, in support of it. Just that was almost kind of like the vibe. A lot of the the white guys from the South, I mean, it was kind of almost, I was crazy Meggyesy. He's this aberrant guy who's really a good football player, but we don't want to know what he's doing. And I wasn't that aberrant. I was just kind of following my Bliss, if you will, following like that. And so,
I like that. You're independent thinker.
Yeah, and it was I never thought of it as a big deal. It was just, seemed very natural and normal to do what I was doing. I mean, I wasn't rebelling against anybody particularly. It was just doing what I felt was best for me and my family and all the rest of it,
So you were able to compartmentalize, if you will, the idea that you could be an independent thinker, but you can work within the team context, which for many old timers and old school coaches was new territory for them.
Yeah, it was frankly, it was new territory, really, because I mean, that whole generation who were the coaches, we have to remember those guys played, and it was really a much more rigid system. And I think if we move history forward, what we're finding out, and probably Pete Carroll with the Seahawks is kind of the exemplar of that, by saying, yes, you need a certain number of rules and all the rest of that for everybody to be able to work together, which, yes, you do. But what they're exploring is what can we do as an organization to encourage the athletic excellence of our players to emerge, to really flower, to thrive. So they do a whole range of activities and things and support to make sure players can do that, as well as getting input from players. So they can tolerate very easily a Richard Sherman, for example. They could, easily tolerate a Marshawn Lynch. They can, it's more than tolerate. And Al Davis used to do that with the Raiders, but it was a little different style because Pete really structurally in the organization has people who can help players become what is the term that's been emerging is a whole person coaching. What do we do to make this guy great? How do we do it? What does he need? Do you need family counseling? Do you need financial counseling? Do you need diet counseling? Do you need strength training counseling? I mean, what do we do? And the proof is kind of in the pudding. I mean, he's been an incredibly successful coach. When you look at where he came from with USC and what he's doing now with Seattle, they're, top 5 teams consistently every year. And so he's doing something right. I mean, he's also getting some really terrific players, and he's got a fantastic quarterback with Wilson. But they also do a hell of a lot to really support their players. So I'm saying that in contrast to the old system, that people really didn't think about that back then, and like hitting, for example. I mean, we used to hit quite a bit. Other teams hit a lot more, but you really didn't need to do that. And we used to say, man, if I don't know how to hit somebody by the time I'm in the league, I'm never going to learn it.
Right, right. And now the NFL has eliminated the 2 a day.
Exactly. And people, they're getting more people hurt. BS.
Only allowed to have 1 day of full practice per week, which is a huge change. But going back to Pete Carroll, sort of acknowledging and accentuating this tribal mentality of a team, that we can all be independent, yet we have a common goal, common vision, and common bond of brotherhood.
Yes.
Speak to that, if you would, the evolution, because this goes right to the whole core of the sports energy consciousness mindset, that you can think independently but act collectively.
Yes, and that, I think, to say again, I think you have a Pete Carroll or a Phil Jackson, who understand that, and what it is you open up the coaching part of it to what the athletes can bring, not just as athletes, but what they can bring in terms of their intelligence about the game. Okay, and just a little story, but I was very fortunate that I had a defensive coach, Chuck Drulis, who did that 1 year, and it was the most exciting experience we had. We led the league in defense that year, and we had maybe one All-Pro, Larry Wilson, and they called it the grab bag defense. But Chuck would involve us. What do you guys think? How do you think? And guys just got so excited. Wow, they're listening. He's listening to us, and he wants he really is listening, and he wants our opinion, and he wants, and then we'd sort it all out. And by God, we put it together. And, Chuck was the first guy to he invented the safety blitz. He invented the corner blitz. We were dropping defensive ends into pass coverage. I mean, he was doing all this stuff 40 years before Buddy Ryan even thought of it.
Interesting.
Well, football, I'm talking to you this way, but I just remember that being such a wonderful experience of how to be a professional athlete. To have, as you say, that independence, but have that collective team and everybody kind of input into it and really create something that we could all buy into and go out and play our asses off and be as successful as we were. And I think this is the kind of thing that Pete is really trying to generate with the Seahawks. And, as I say, the proof is in the pudding, They're doing.
You've got such a wealth of knowledge and experience and stories to share about the history of the game and the evolution of the NFL. But getting into the mind game of peak performance, that's something I think I would love to hear you expound upon. 7 years in the NFL, playing against the very best in the world.
Right.
And as we all know, it's not the biggest, fastest, strongest guy who will prevail in a given day, play, game, career. It's more than that. So why don't you take us inside the mindset of the elite NFL athlete on game day or leading up to it to prepare for that challenge?
Well, I can, this will be a little bit of a dissertation here, but if you believe, and a lot of coaches will say, well, elite, excellent performance is 90% mental, 10% physical. You go, okay, yeah, I got that. And then you say, what kind of mental training do you do if you consider the game 90% mental and 10% physical? How much mental training do you do, and how much physical training do you do? Good question. Almost 100% physical training. Well, if you think it's important, why don't you address that issue, or figure out what can I do, what is it about mental training that could enhance an athlete's performance, if you were a coach, for example. Now, so starting from there, and then with because it follows a notion of action follows thought, okay, what I have going on in my psyche, in my mind, is going to determine hugely what goes on in my performance. And so if you start from there, start from that standpoint, what can you do to begin looking at inner game training, mindset training? What can we do to allow and encourage, and not allow so much, but encourage athletes to become more successful if they used appropriate, what I call consciousness technology, as part of their training. Okay. Now, the analogy I use, or the example I use, when I played in the NFL from 63 to 69, we did not have a weight room. And the coaches thought, the view was, weight training is going to make you tight, is going to make you less athletic. Now, we're a sport, football, right? We had two guys, Bob Reynolds, who came from Bowling Green, and Dan Goich, who played at Cal, was a friend of mine. Both, they were begging the Cardinal management, please get some weights, because they had lifted in college. And one was a defensive lineman, one was an offensive lineman. And so the Cardinal management, and they were not noticed to be big spenders, but they broke down and bought one of those old universal machines. I call it the 5 stations on the cross, and they put it in the storeroom with a hanging light bulb where the socks and jocks and footballs were stored. And they said to Bob and Dan, "There's your weight room. There's your weight room."
Hard to believe. It's hard to believe.
Exactly. Now, what's in touch sports? Golfers, baseball players lift weights. Are you crazy? Are you crazy? But now we've seen the evolution of that. So what I say is, if we look at mental training or the consciousness training, that's where weight training was 50 years ago in sports. Okay. And we're starting to see it really open up, where coaches are realizing, wow, a few things that I can teach my athletes, and they practice and practice and practice it, like strength training, they're going to be much better athletes. And I know you did a thing, I think, with Greg Warburton. I mean, who's worked with the Oregon State baseball players. I mean, NCAA champs. I mean, people are now starting to discover that there is a lot of tremendous amount of benefit of teaching athletes how to appropriately mentally train, like you teach an athlete how to appropriately strength train to be a better athlete. So, and that's a big component of what what SEC is all about, is developing that and encouraging coaches to basically put together some of those techniques and technologies for their athletes. And it's a very exciting time, because I think the door is just finally starting to open over the last, really literally in the last 5 to 8 years, what we're really seeing it. And to say again, Pete Carroll, I think, has been kind of he's been a kind of a bell cow in putting this idea together, that this is important to do.
Sure. Well, train the mind and the body.
Exactly. Train the mind and the body. It's not either or, but
sure.
But the old code, well, it's 90% mental. Yeah, well, how much of the mental do you do? Well,
yeah.
Not really.
So what did you do? We talk about athletes or football players watching film and looking for tendencies, but how about the mental mindset that you brought to either practice that spilled over into game day as a preparatory?
Well, yeah, and Rich, what I say is that you elite athletes have to develop a certain mental training process. And it's about focus, and it's about, appropriate energy. I mean, how to describe it, I don't even know how to describe it, but it has to do with that. And so practice, repetition, knowing what you're doing, getting into what you call getting your game face on, getting into that psychological state, which when you do it after a while, you become familiar and you say, well, what did I do? Well, a lot of guys will have a very ritualized process as they come into the game. You know, I arrive at the locker room a certain time, I do this, this, and this, and this. I would tie my shoelaces 20 times, literally. And what it was a way of focusing. It was also probably a way of binding anxiety. But I think when you're at that level, you're aware that you have to be at what you know to be a good inner state to go out and play. And a lot of elite athletes have developed their own systems or their own ways of doing that. And it would be fascinating. And I know, you know a number of guys, the Steve Youngs of the world, to sit down and say, okay, Steve, how did you do it? You know?
Yeah.
And really, and you'll find a lot of guys have a fairly detailed system of how they get ready to play. Call it getting ready to play. And because you know what is demanded mentally in being in that crucible. And I think, you know, one of the things that we're trying to do with SEC is to really look at some of those techniques and then say, okay, to tell coaches, you can teach your athletes these ways to drop in.
And the counter to that, or the sidebar to that, would be Mike Tyson would say, everyone's got a game plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? Here you are in a football game. You have a mental mindset, which is critical to peak performance, yet somebody belts you, or you run into an obstacle that you didn't anticipate, or the opponent is better than you thought. And now it's plan B time, something you may not have prepared for.
Not necessarily. It may be something you haven't prepared for, but that kind of mental resiliency is part of that mindset training, that you don't get knocked off, that you can, okay, come back. And you'll see, I mean, you see it now, you know, a cornerback, you know, who get beat on an incredible pass, you know, but they call it, you got to shake it off. Yeah, you do. And most of the guys, they have that ability to do that. That was that. I mean, when you think about it, that implication, boom, you come right back to that state where you know that's where your peak performance is, that feeling inner state, and that's part of it. And yeah, plan B happens all the time when you play. I mean,
right.
That's, of course, this is all about coaching, is how to, you know, knock players off their keys and give them plan Bs and plan Cs. So you're a opponent. Yeah.
Were you an emotionally charged guy on the field, or do you, like some have maintained, you should keep your composure in any situation, whether you just scored the touchdown, act like you've been there, or you gave up the sack as an offensive lineman, or you threw the interception as a quarterback. Don't emote. Do not show. So that's one school of thought. The other might be get it out in a flash and then gather yourself and carry on.
Yeah, I mean, you have to do the latter because you get beat. You know, I mean, in any professional athlete, as you call, you get beat. You know, and in football, it's so much man on man, and you get beat. Well, if you get beat, you got to come back, and you can't worry about your ability to play or emote about it. I mean, you've got to be able to drop back in. And what I'm saying, that's part of the mental, some people call it the mental toughness or mental conditioning, that you have to acquire as an elite athlete. If you can't do that, you can't be at that level. Okay, because if coaches will know, look, if we beat this guy, he's going to fall apart. They're going to come back after you the next play. So they, you know, and so everybody has to know you can drop back in and be as capable on the following play as you were on that play, but unfortunately you got beat. So
now, for a guy who helped co-found the Esalen, the Sports Center, yeah, and you taught at Stanford, so obviously a cerebral, you know, deep thinking guy. Now you run into the question: of getting in the zone, staying in the zone. That day you faced Jim Brown, or your ultimate challenger, the game that decided the win or lose for the season, making the playoffs or not. Tell me how you were able to either manifest your best or the challenges you faced and perhaps not fulfilled.
Well, it's interesting. It remembered two memories. One when I did tackle Jim Brown one time, he you have your helmet and you got an ear hole, right? And after I tackled him, I was looking out my ear hole. My nose was kind of over there.
Spun your helmet right around, huh?
Well, about halfway, a quarter of the way around. I'm looking at the ear hole. and I don't think I've ever been hit harder by any running back in my life. And
get in line, right? I mean, you were at the first and you weren't the last.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was they ran him on a sweep. I posted the tight end, dropped the tight end, dove right at him and made the tackle, and he got me with one of his famous forearms, and I kind of half tackled him, and teammates came, but woke up. I got up and I was looking out my ear hole. Yeah, that guy can hit.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think that it gets back to again what I was just saying, and not belabor it too much, is you have to be able to kind of come back to who you are and what you are, and know that you're capable of doing it. Against Cleveland once, I did freak out. I got beat and I freaked out, and I realized, and thank God they didn't come back at me, because I knew I had lost my focus, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
But and it was a little scary, but it did happen, and I think probably happens to everybody a bit.
Sure.
And but I think it's that, and the language doesn't really quite do it, but there's a certain kind of resiliency, or a certain kind of being able to drop back into yourself, if you will, knowing you can play and knowing you're capable. Okay, bring them on, come on, keep coming on. You
Mm-hmm.
can, and you have to. Have that mentality, or you can't play at the elite level. I mean, like I said, we see it all the time, because the best get beat,
So in terms of the zone where you felt absolutely at your peak or pinnacle of performance and fluidity and strength and vision, was there any mechanism that you use to engender that state?
Not really.
Well,
there's a base state, but I think the question you're asking, but sometimes, and this is what got me interested in Mike Murphy's writings, his Golf in the Kingdom, and I began looking at consciousness. I call it consciousness in sport, because there were a number of times that I went into a different kind of zone, and athletes talk about this, where everything was moving slower. I could see the whole pattern, and I had this kind of precognitive, if you will. I knew where the play was going, and playing had this effortless quality. And this is what one of our guys, Scott Ford, talks about, being in the zone, where you really just, I call it, you drop into this, psychic space, if you will, this mental space, emotional space, and people write about it. And people have researched it. They call it the zone, or into flow, where you are really flowing with what's going on. And it's absolutely natural. It's the most liberating, natural kind of feeling you can have as an athlete. But always the question would be to myself, asking myself, damn, how did I do that?
Mm-hmm. How did I get there? How the
hell did we do that?
Or Scott Ford says, getting into the zone by choice, not chance. Exactly. Easier said than done.
Easier said than done. And that's part of what the work of SEC is, to try to figure out what are the best inner techniques to be able what I say is have the zone more available to the athlete. It's almost like a gift that you get. You know what I mean? And I think with Scott's work, which was truly brilliant, is to be able to do certain things playing tennis where you can drop into the zone or into flow much more easily and much more often than you can not in playing tennis in a different way. That, well, you're a tennis player. So, and I think all sports have that, and it's one of the wonderful frontiers that we're really looking at with SEC, is to really ask that question: how do we get into this flow state or this zone state? Because all elite athletes also have experienced that. But it's kind of, I call it the elephant in the living room. Nobody talks about that.
Right. Except us. Except us.
Except, well, too. You ask how somebody had a great game, what do you ask them? And they'll tell you, well, just everything was working. I don't know.
Well, the worst question that I hear all the time from TV and radio reporters in the locker room or on post-game shows after when they're interviewing the triumphant star of the game is, what were you thinking when you hit that home run or caught the touchdown pass?
You hit it.
I scream at the TV or the radio, good golly, that's the last thing. That's
the stupidest question.
The last
well, my analogy, Rich, is this. I say it's like you're madly in love and you got this incredibly hot girlfriend, wife, whatever, and you've just made mad, passionate love, and you walk out of the bedroom and this reporter sticks a mic into your face and said, how did you feel about that?
Yeah, right. Wait, that's the second one. How did you feel?
What were you thinking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were
very much of a similar. Yeah, it's a very much of a similar thing. You've just been in this, and not to blow it up too much, it's almost sacred kind of moments or period of time, and somebody, will tell me how'd you feel about that? What do you think about that? Oh shit, I don't have any idea. It was wonderful. What do I say?
Yeah. That old line, when you think you stink, and just the idea that the brain can get in the way.
Yeah, exactly.
It's trusting the practice, the routine, creative visualization, the confidence you had from prior experiences and successes to perform in the moment as it unfolds without thinking.
Yeah. That's too complicated.
Your brain can get in the way.
Your brain got in the way.
Well, it can be our greatest ally.
No, it's true. But that is really, and so I think part of what we're doing with SEC is I call how do we plow the ground and make it fertile so that these extraordinary events can happen. And I think sport really is kind of a theater for the exceptional, for the extraordinary. And we see that in performance. And the wonderful thing about sport is we can measure that exceptionalness. I mean, you remember the pre-4-minute mile days, right?
Sure.
And then it happened, and then, well, what's going on here? I mean, and that's one of the wonderful dimensions, I think, of sport, is that we really can see the supernormal expressed. And what we have to say about that legitimately is human beings are capable of extraordinary things. So when you start talking about the human potential, or what is our potential as human beings, and how is that demonstrated or expressed in sport, that's one of the things we're really looking at SEC too. And I think people see it all the time. And I really believe that's one of the things that really attract people to sport, is experiencing viscerally, not with their thinking mind, but viscerally, these exceptional, extraordinary moments.
Right. These transcendent moments. We watch the Olympics.
Beautiful. Transcendent moments. And you, as a sports journalist, and you had this incredible career, I mean, you saw so much of this. Well, how you can't even talk about it. You go, holy cow.
Can't put it into words. I was
you can't put it in words, yeah.
I was the sideline reporter when Joe Montana and Steve Young were quarterbacking the 49ers and battling for that job. But I remember being on the field, watching Joe Montana pump right. He would look right, look left, and begin throwing back where he first looked, and was throwing the ball before he looked there, and would make the connection with Jerry Rice or John Taylor, and it would defy anybody's idea of how in the world he could do it. But he had that je ne sais quoi, that sixth sense, that transcendent
whatever
gift,
he had. That
gift. And you watch you watch Usain Bolt run, or watching the figure skating, the Olympics. That is
swim. I mean, it's just and it's all of the stuff. It's it's the training, it's the work, it's the practice. But there is that something that happens. But I like to say, we have to plow the ground good. We have to make it plow the ground fertile. So it can happen fertile. Yeah. And to make it happen, allow it to happen for athletes to experience this more, because to me, I mean, and often, and maybe you have this experience if you talk to guys who played 20 years ago, and you could ask, what was your, tell me what was one of your best events that ever happened. I mean, they'll give you the rendition in absolutely precise detail.
Mm-hmm. Things slow down, and you could see it more clearly.
Exactly, and you never forget it. I mean, you go, that's what happened, and that can be expressed. So this is one of the edges that we are pushing into with SEC and trying to articulate it a little better, but also to, as I say, fertilize the soil to make these experiences happen more often. And I think in the social sense, if more people are experiencing these things, having these transcendent level of experience, they're going to be less interested in smacking people over the head and killing each other.
We've come up with this phrase, the Omni Athlete.
Right.
The one who can combine the physical, the mental, spiritual connection to performance.
Right.
So in your own words, tell me what that means to you and how it manifests for you in your day.
Well, I think what it means, and there's a word that's around, it's we call it the integral athlete, and basically it means paying attention to all the different components of this thing, which I call the athletic experience, and we call sport. And there are all these different dimensions to it. And one of the things that we know about sport, as the old coaches used to say, well, sport's a character building thing. Yeah. What kind of character are you building? What are you talking about? Well, sport can be a revealer physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, transcendently. And the whole idea for the Omni Athlete is to really start looking at sport in this bigger picture. Omni, that's what that means, in this larger view, larger picture, and then develop the integral relationships between these different aspects, emotional, mental, physical, spiritual, so on, and then start looking at how do we train to that? How do we train to that? Right. Because there are now in the culture what I call a huge number of consciousness practices, inner game practices that can apply to sport. And what we're finding out is a lot of athletes who are coming to us from SEC actually use a lot. And of course, everybody knows about visualization and mental rehearsal and dropping into the optimal athlete, all these different things that you can do, the tapping that Greg does. And so we're seeing these different approaches emerge that basically do this that integrate these different parts of ourselves to allow us to be, what I say, better performing, and where sport is, we perform our sport better and we enjoy it more. So,
there you go. Well said.
That's what we're trying to do.
And in closing, what is the Meggyesy legacy?
Well, I should probably write my own. What I'm going to write on my tombstone? I have no idea. I mean, I don't know. I think probably what I'd like to think is that I made a positive difference in the world. I think ultimately it boils down to that. When we step back and realize that we are co-creators of our world and our universe, as some people think, and I tend to believe that, but certainly our world, our existence on this planet. And I guess I would have to say I've left something positive here. I exit.
Absolutely.
Not too many years from now, but
and you're not leaving us anytime soon, my friend. You got way too much to give and way too much.
Well, thank you, Rich, and to say you too as well. And we had our little email exchange today, and I mean it. So I appreciate the conversation, and maybe a little long-winded sometime. But,
no, you nailed it, and you lived it, and you shared it, and thank you.
Yeah, and I think in closing, sport is a very powerful process. It certainly brings people together. We see that, what the Olympic ideal was. It certainly is a way to drop ourselves into greater self-awareness and self-understanding. We know that. Certainly the Greeks, 2,000 years ago plus, put that idea together. So it's a very strong and powerful process and a very enriching process. And what we're trying to do is really just give it its biggest kind of frame, to really look at it, which it richly deserves, by the way, because there's so much going on. And you as a guy who's covered it at the level that you did for as long as you did, really saw this happening so often.
Well, I saw it, you lived it, and that is the Meggyesy legacy.
Well,
thanks, Dave. It was an awesome time.
Thanks. Okay.